Well, hello and welcome to In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, which is a new YouTube series of interviews on Hong Kong produced by Hong Kong Watch. And I am Benedict Rogers. And it's a great privilege. This is the second episode in this series. You may remember we had the father of democracy in Hong Kong, Martin Lee, for our first episode. It's a great privilege and delight to welcome one of Hong Kong Watch's patrons, a long-standing friend of mine, a real champion of human rights around the world, Lord Alton of Liverpool. Lord Alton, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
Let me start with the first question. There are many grave human rights challenges and causes around the world, many of which you yourself already champion. What made you decide to take up Hong Kong and be so active on its behalf?
My interest in Hong Kong probably began when I was a student a million years ago. One of the subjects I became particularly interested in was Victorian British history, and I followed what the British had done during the Opium Wars. One person emerged from those Opium Wars with his reputation outstanding when the rest of the country's reputation was dragged through the mire, and that was William Ewart Gladstone, who, as a young member of Parliament, opposed the Opium Wars and said it would bring eternal shame to Britain, and that it was the worst way that a country that had world reach, that was a part of a huge empire, the worst way that it could possibly behave. So it was interesting to look at that in the context of other things that had happened during that period, such as the slave trade. And then after my student days, I became very close to some of the Chinese community in Liverpool. I'd taught as a volunteer. I taught young people who were immigrants to Britain from China, some of whom had escaped from the Cultural Revolution, and I taught them English. And I became close to their families, and after I was elected to the House of Commons, I went to stay with some of those families in Hong Kong. That was in 1980. And the year after that, I traveled to the mainland. I went to Shanghai, and I saw the other side of the coin, the contrast between the freedoms that Hong Kong then enjoyed, despite the fact that I was critical of the way in which Britain had failed to provide adequate democracy over the period. It had seen it as a trading post. It had seen it as a place to exploit in some ways for commercial and entrepreneurial purposes. And I felt that people in Hong Kong wanted more than that. And constantly the government would say things like, oh, well, people in Hong Kong are only interested in making money, not in democracy. And I knew that that was just not true and was a lie. And so as we started to then have debates in Parliament, I was then the Liberal Party's Home Affairs spokesman. We had a debate on the future of Hong Kong and what that would mean in terms of nationality. And I argued then that all people living in Hong Kong who wanted to continue living in a free and democratic society, who wanted that opportunity, should have the right to come to the United Kingdom or to other English-speaking countries where they would enjoy those rights. And that was never included. It was always the barrier that was placed in the legislation was a financial one, so that people with money would be able to come, but not others. So that was where my interest in the people of Hong Kong and China began, but I also started to learn more and more about the enormities of the Cultural Revolution, the imposition of things like the one-child policy. And as the years went by, I campaigned with people like Chen Guangcheng, who was the blind human rights activist who spent 4 years in solitary confinement in prison because he'd shone a light on the horrors that had taken place in the Shandong province, where over 130,000 women had been forcibly aborted or sterilized. Eventually, of course, Cheng was released, and one of the most wonderful moments of my time at Westminster was presenting him with the Westminster Award for human rights, human life, and human dignity. So my interest goes back a long way. Obviously, as I've seen the curtailment of two systems, one country, and the basic law, when you and Hong Kong Watch invited me to become a patron of Hong Kong Watch, I readily agreed.
Well, thank you, and we're enormously glad that you did. The announcement last week by Beijing of the imposition through the National People's Congress on Hong Kong of a new national security law takes the situation to a whole new level. What are your reflections on the implications of this for freedom, including perhaps for religious freedom, which obviously is a cause you have particularly championed around the world, and your reflections on the events over the last 6 years or so that have led up to this, where we've seen a steady increasing erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms.
I think for me, the turning point was Tiananmen Square, because the pro-democracy movement in China itself was crushed with the full force of the Chinese state. And people then started to learn the difference between loving China, having huge respect for its people and a love of its culture and great civilization, and the deeds of the Chinese Communist Party. These are two separate phenomena. Now, Deng Xiaoping started to see the need for change. He realized that you could no longer continue to run your entire country as a totalitarian police state without really courting long-term catastrophe and disaster. And so it was Deng who started to have this conversion, as it were, a change of heart, change of mind, one which for many of us was like a breath of fresh air. And there came a point, of course, when Margaret Thatcher was with Deng Xiaoping talking about the future of Hong Kong. And he said, well, we could walk in tomorrow and take it all. And she said, yes, but the eyes of the world would be on you. They would see what you're made of. And he understood that. And that is why they negotiated the basic law, two systems, one country, and realized that if you kill Hong Kong, you kill one of the great cities of Asia. You also damage the most important engine room for the Chinese economy as well. It's the point of contact between the East and West. It's the place where the two cultures, the two peoples can meet freely. And that's where Hong Kong has enjoyed this extraordinary, unique position in all our imaginations. And why I think that between them, that Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping created such important circumstances. One of the things that Hong Kong enjoys, which mainland China has not enjoyed, of course, is religious freedom. So the political liberties that gradually were brought, not least thanks to Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, but which the British were able to bequeath through the Legislative Council and through the work of people like the wonderful Martin Lee and the civil liberties, human rights, democratic movement in Hong Kong. In addition to those political liberties, at the part of the DNA of Hong Kong is religious freedom. And I've got by my side here this marvelous book by Cardinal Zen, entitled "For Love of My People, I Will Not Remain Silent," and which is a great proclamation of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that spells out that every person has the right to believe, not to believe, or to change their belief. And he reminds me a lot of Cardinal Kung, who was imprisoned for 40 years, the Bishop of Shanghai, who stood for freedom of religion and belief in mainland China. So Cardinal Zen understands that story, the suffering, the privations, the depredations that were experienced by the believing communities of China. And in this day, it isn't just the Christian communities. You think of the Falun Gong, you think of the Tibetan Buddhists. I've been to Tibet, I've been in Western China, and you think now of the million Uyghurs who are incarcerated in Xinjiang. So put all those things together, and you can see why, if you look over the bamboo curtain from Hong Kong into mainland China, you would see all the things that you hold dear: political rights, the rule of law, the chance to make a decent living, the prosperity that has gone with all that, and freedom of religion or belief. And you see all those things being threatened and compromised. And that is why Chris Patten has been right to say that the events of the last few hours, the decision of the Chinese Communist Party to change the basic law, to impose all of the apparatus of a police state in Hong Kong, why Chris Patten has described that as outrageous, and why we have a historic, political and moral duty to stand with the people of Hong Kong.
You signed a statement that was led, in fact, by Chris Patten, and along with over 200 parliamentarians, former prime ministers, former foreign ministers, other very distinguished people from 23 different countries around the world on Hong Kong, specifically in response to this proposed new national security law. Why do you think such a statement is significant?
I was very struck in Washington a few months ago at a conference I attended, but there was Nancy Pelosi from a Democratic Party, Frank Wolf from the Republican Party, sitting together and, as it were, singing from the same hymn sheet. People may be left and right, but at the tectonic plates all over the world have moved. The left had a sort of idealized, romanticized view of the Chinese Communist Party, that somehow it was all going to go Gorbachev style and it was going to change and there'd be the equivalent of perestroika and it would all come good. That hasn't happened. And I think the left have been deceived and have been amazingly silent about the horrors that have been inflicted on the people of China. But on the right, I see people who have been bedazzled by money and wealth and think that our economy in some way is dependent on what happens in China. Now, both of these are fictions. And I think we've seen the tectonic plates move. I think we're seeing people now realize that actually Hong Kong is like Berlin was during the Cold War. It is the city that is telling its own story, that everything will depend in the whole, certainly in Asia, and I would argue worldwide, on what now happens in Hong Kong. They have been like the geese that roused the citadel in ancient Rome when times were bad, when there was a danger that was threatening the citadel. And I think that we should be listening to very carefully to what the people of Hong Kong are saying. I think it's the reason why around the world, politicians, rather than being left and right, they're learning the difference between right and wrong. And that's why so many have signed this statement declaring their solidarity with the people of Hong Kong. That also has been informed by a number of other events, of course, not just Hong Kong, but what has been happening to the Uyghurs. The Islamic world is waking up to what is happening to other Muslims who are being degraded, forced to eat pork, who are, their culture, their religion, everything is being re-educated, just as in the days of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. They see the surveillance technology that's being used. They're waking up to the realities of Chinese companies being able to not just use the whole of our telecommunications infrastructure, but even wanting to own major assets, everything from British Steel right the way through to Buckingham Palace. If it's up for sale, the Chinese will take it. This cannot be in anybody's national interest. So I can see why people are waking up to these realities. It's a tragedy in some ways, because of course it's setting back our relationship with mainland China. But I think that's a temporary aberration. Our relationship in the long term is with the people of China. And I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party will survive any more than the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union survived.
Absolutely. It is interesting how the whole world is waking up. I mean, even we've seen the appalling treatment of African citizens in China, and how African Union countries who previously had very good relations with the Chinese government have been speaking up. So you're absolutely right that the whole world is waking up. Last December,
on Africa, Ben, I mean, people in African countries, I serve on the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Select Committee, and we're currently carrying out an inquiry into sub-Saharan Africa. So we've been hearing first-hand evidence of the indebtedness of African countries, who, again, have been dazzled, have been told, we will give you whatever you need. And you know, there's a real need for the building of infrastructure. There's a real need to help develop African economies, but not to the point where Belt and Road becomes just a noose around the necks of African countries, where the indebtedness becomes so great that the very things that we thought we'd help to wipe out in the year of Jubilee in 2000, the indebtedness of African nations, which were suffocating their economies, is happening all over again. And of course, with that comes the Chinese Communist Party's ideological system as well. If you read Julia Lovell's extraordinarily brilliant book, Maoism, she traces the effects in Africa of Maoism, going right the way back to the earliest days of the Cultural Revolution, the bringing of African leaders, the taking them to Beijing, the treating them as though they were demigods, and then, of course, exploiting all the opportunities that go with that. This is about minerals, this is about food, this is about oil, this is about all the assets that Africa's got, and it's the classic example of all the things that the European colonialists did in countries like the Congo, the DRC, It's scandalous that that happened in the past, but it's happening all over again. And a country that suffered under colonialism, as China did, should not be practicing the very things that were done against it during its own time.
I absolutely agree with all of that, and I would endorse your recommendation of Julia Lovell's book, Maoism. In fact, viewers might be able to see it on the bookshelf behind me, along with, I should say, Winnie the Pooh sitting there. And there's a particular reason Winnie the Pooh is there. I don't just have him as a sort of fluffy bear. There's, of course, the political symbolism of the fact that the Chinese regime banned Winnie the Pooh because allegedly comparisons were made between the appearance of Pooh Bear and Xi Jinping, and a regime that is so sensitive and vulnerable even to Winnie the Pooh surely is not actually a world superpower, but a very nervous and frightened and therefore bullying and repressive regime.
I think we should always keep a sense of perspective and humour about ourselves as well, and politicians should learn to laugh at themselves and not always take themselves quite as seriously perhaps as they do. It is, however, worth thinking back to the period of the 1980s when I travelled during that time in the former Soviet Union and saw an edifice that everyone said would stand for 1,000 years, the same sort of things that the Reich had said about itself. But in fact, we all woke up one morning in 1989 and saw the Berlin Wall crumbling. We saw the edifice fall because people themselves had said, enough, we want the rule of law, we want democracy, we want human rights, we want all the basic liberties and freedoms, the very things that Hong Kong enjoys today, that Taiwan enjoys today. People of Taiwan are being threatened in exactly the same way that the small nations were threatened in Europe by the former Soviet Union, but who got the last laugh? So I'm not sure about Winnie the Pooh, but I do know this, that leaders themselves need to stay close to the people. They need to understand when the moment for reform and change has come, and Deng Xiaoping understood that. It took the horrors of Tiananmen Square to bring it about, but he did change, and his country started to change. The tragedy is that the economic reforms have not been accompanied by all of the political reforms that must accompany those things. You can't be the other America, which is what China says it will be, without all the ingredients that make America great. And that is about, particularly more than anything else, personal freedom and liberty. China says, look how we've handled the coronavirus, COVID-19. And you see all of the attributes of an authoritarian, totalitarian state, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, this began in China, notwithstanding the fact that a young doctor who tried to tell the world and warn the world what was happening was then silenced and some of his colleagues incarcerated, and that young doctor finally dying on the hospital wards looking after people who contracted the virus. Notwithstanding what was done to the World Health Organization with its subversion and with an attempt to manipulate it, along with other United Nations agencies, notwithstanding all of those things, you look at then Taiwan, which is not even allowed to be a member of the World Health Organization, so disinterested is China in health, only interested in control and authoritarianism, and yet Taiwan, without any of the attributes of an authoritarian police state, they've been able to control the virus in an extraordinary way, just through personal resilience, through good public health measures, and all the other things that should have flowed in our Western democracies. So you can see the strengths and the weaknesses, but I do not believe a state like the one governed by the Chinese Communist Party can survive. Will China survive? Of course it will. It's a great, great country and a great nation and great civilization. It's not about to disappear. What we all want for China is genuine harmony and unity, but that doesn't come through repression. It doesn't come through totalitarianism.
Absolutely, and that's an incredibly important message that I'm glad you put across, that it's not China that we have any problem with. Indeed, you and I and all of us involved in this love China as a country. It's the Chinese Communist Party specifically that is the problem. But just coming back now to Hong Kong, you visited Hong Kong last December as part of an election observation mission to monitor the district council elections. What were your impressions from that visit?
It was an exhilarating, extraordinary experience to see this surge of democracy in a place where we were told that people were only interested in making money, that people really were quite happy to live under a totalitarian system. Here, through the secrecy of the ballot box, without anyone being able to watch how people voted, saw a huge landslide in favor of the pro-democracy parties. And what that election was about, it was like a referendum. It was district council elections, but it was an extraordinary referendum on whether democracy was what Hong Kong wanted. And the vote was for more democracy, not less. But highlights of that visit for me were meeting people like Jimmy Sham, who'd been picked up off the roadside, having been beaten up with crowbars, standing fearlessly in those elections and being elected. Meeting people like Joshua Wong, and who I chaired meetings for in the Palace of Westminster with Nathan Law. You know, two young pro-democracy advocates who stand for the future of Hong Kong. And I was able to give Joshua the Westminster Award for human rights, human life, and human dignity, which he'd been banned by the Hong Kong authorities from being able to come to Westminster to receive. So this was a memorable visit for me as part of an international group. We saw fair and free elections being well administered. And it was a moment where Carrie Lam, if she'd seized it, a moment for change. And instead of which, it was like the doors just closed again once the election was over. Rather than setting up a consultative group with all of those who had just been elected, these brand new district councillors, genuine grassroots leadership, instead of engaging with them and trying to put an end to the protests and the violence that there'd been on the streets of Hong Kong, I felt that Carrie Lam wasted this extraordinary opportunity, and it's a tragedy for Hong Kong that that happened. And here we now are, roll the clock forward. We have the Chinese Communist Party trying to impose new police state laws on Hong Kong, and all that will do is to incite yet more protests. And that's in nobody's interest. I want to see a future for Hong Kong, which is based not, as happened yesterday, with a 5.5% reduction in the Hang Seng Index, 5.5%. I don't want to see the goose that lays the golden egg killed. I don't want to see an exodus of people to Singapore or wherever it may be. I want Hong Kong to flourish, but it won't flourish on this kind of basis. So here was the opportunity, and here is the future. So listen to people like Martin Lee, instead of arresting him and his colleagues, people like Margaret and these extraordinary people who have been towering figures in the story of Hong Kong's democracy movement, instead of arresting an 81-year-old and threatening him with years in prison, they should be instead making him a laureate and saying, these are the people who saw how the future will be. They should be taking people like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law and saying, these are young people representative of their generation. Let's build a new society around them. And that truly would be harmonious. That is the very thing that Beijing needs to understand, because carrying on as they're doing will just entrench the disparity between mainland China and the rest of the world. It creates a sort of isolationism, and it forces Australia and Canada, the United States, Great Britain, or the European Union, it forces them into hostility against the Chinese Communist Party instead of engagement. So this cannot be in their interest. And the more that they do of this, the more there will be demands to emulate the American laws on Hong Kong, the more there will be demands at Westminster for Magnitsky powers, which the British government have said they're going to introduce, which will target people who have used brutality, who have tried to impose violence, and who have tried to destroy two systems, one country, and to reverse all the gains that Hong Kong believed it had made during those historic talks and an international treaty, more to the point, made between the United Kingdom and China, all of which is being upended.
Well, on the subject of the United Kingdom and its responsibilities, Britain does have specific responsibilities to British national overseas passport holders. But of course, there are also many vulnerable frontline political activists in Hong Kong who are not BNOs, but who might at some point need protection. What do you think are the ways forward for Britain to both better protect BNOs and at the same time give some reassurance to non-BNO Hong Kongers who may be in danger?
I helped to organise a letter from across both Houses of Parliament. A couple of hundred members of Parliament signed that letter, including former leaders of political parties, former cabinet ministers, in other words, very senior figures at Westminster, saying that we, Britain, should lead an international initiative, starting perhaps with the Commonwealth, which includes, of course, India, includes Canada, Australia, many of the African countries, where we would guarantee second citizenship to all people in Hong Kong, not just BNO holders, all citizenship, all citizens in Hong Kong, and a second right of abode, so that if the Chinese Communist Party is determined to continue with the asphyxiation of Hong Kong, there will be a place for people in Hong Kong to go. That, I think, would actually be the best deterrence that we could offer. And I would hope that countries like the United States would get in behind this, that Taiwan would get in behind it. So many countries from around the world, Japan, I would hope, would be part of such an alliance, but starting with the Commonwealth. And this is something that the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, headed by Dominic Raab, should do. There is some movement on British nationality, passport holders, but frankly, of what use will that be to ordinary people who have been involved in the democracy movement, the ones who will be the most vulnerable? I mean, when the knock comes on the door in the middle of the night, it won't be for the most wealthy who have lived in, palatial circumstances and who have been quite happy to deal with China and to make their money. It will be people who have stood for democracy and the rule of law. So I think that the argument around BNO is a very selective one. There are some people, undoubtedly, those who serve the Crown, those who were part of our police force at the time when it was the Royal Hong Kong Police Force and had one of the best reputations of any police force in Asia. There were people who served in the armed forces, and they are a different category whom I would always say should be given the right of abode and the right to settle with full citizenship in the United Kingdom. I've argued that since 1981. So I'm not changing my mind or having a change of heart about this, but I don't think that just talking about the wealthiest, which is what we have done in the past, is the solution for the people of Hong Kong. It needs an international agreement. And I suspect that the events of the last few days, the decisions of the Chinese Communist Party, have made that more likely now than ever before, which is why politicians and statesmen and women from around the world have been coming together to form a new alliance of parliamentarians who will stand together assessing the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, but particularly looking at the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong. I think that we have to take the same approach that we took during the Cold War. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, all understood the importance of putting human rights at the heart of what was previously called MAD, mutually assured destruction, where cruise and Pershing missiles were ranged against SS-20s and SS-22s. And if you live on the island of Taiwan at the moment and you see Chinese missiles pointing at you, if you're aware of the military might of the Chinese Communist Party, of course you would be fearful of these things. But in that kind of war, vast numbers, millions would die in any kind of nuclear war, should it escalate into such a contest. So that's in neither the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, because Beijing would be destroyed just as Taipei would be destroyed. There's no future in this. So what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan understood was that through the Helsinki process, we had to have a concentration on the freedoms and liberties that would change the former Soviet Union. And of course, Sharansky, Solzhenitsyn, many of the great heroes of that period were prepared to stand for democratic values and take all the consequences, including being sent to gulags in Siberia. And have no doubt that those who have been arrested in mainland China, who include extraordinary political figures, artists, writers, people who have dared to speak out on the internet, there are already people suffering in the way that Solzhenitsyn suffered. And in Hong Kong, we've seen the arrest of Martin Lee and Margaret Ng, Jimmy Lai, people like this extraordinary people of great caliber who will suffer and are suffering in exactly the same way. But through Helsinki came fundamental change. We saw glasnost, we saw perestroika, and we saw the liberation of all these fiefdoms, countries like Poland and the Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, or Romania. I was in Romania during the period when it fell. Ceausescu had thought he was impregnable. It wasn't so. We saw in East Germany the fall of that regime. We saw Albania. All these countries, one after another, like a game of grandmother's footsteps, began to topple as people took control and power for themselves, and finally change in Russia itself. Now, isn't perfect. It isn't perfect, but many of those nations have come to enjoy freedoms and prosperity, and it's a work in progress. And I think that we will see the same thing happen. What we need is Helsinki with Chinese characteristics.
Well, thank you. You've talked about Magnitsky sanctions earlier. We've talked about BNO. You've outlined Helsinki with Chinese characteristics. What else do you think Britain should be doing? And are you satisfied that the response by the United Kingdom, given that it's the co-signatory to the joint declaration and given our history with Hong Kong, has our response been enough so far?
I think it's been a measured response, and I have a lot of respect for Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, and Lord Alton of Wimbledon, who is the Minister of State, who speaks on these issues in the House of Lords. And I know that they care deeply what is happening in Hong Kong. I want to see the opposition saying more, and I think we will now hear more from the opposition under Sir Keir Starmer. I think that the proposition I argued for a few minutes ago about citizenship, an insurance policy for people in Hong Kong, should be at the heart of how we proceed. It isn't confrontational for us to do this. It would be building an alliance around the world and saying, we will offer the people of Hong Kong this insurance policy should all else fail. That will concentrate the minds of Beijing. So this isn't about building up weaponry or wanting to precipitate conflict, quite the reverse. It is building up the values, building up the laws, building up the rights that we believe that we have been able to negotiate successfully at the time of the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China. So I think that we have to carry on doing that. We have to also stand with the people of Hong Kong during this time so that they don't feel that we've abandoned them. And I want to hear the Prime Minister perhaps saying more to them. Now, he has been obviously unwell. He's been distracted by this pandemic that we're all facing. So it's not a moment to be particularly critical, but to be encouraging, to say more and to speak out and to make it clear that we will be at the very heart of an international alliance, a political alliance, an alliance of non-governmental organizations, an alliance of ordinary peoples around the world, the diaspora, which is a rich diaspora in every sense. I mean, it's got resources, but it's got extraordinary people within it who should be standing up and being counted. This is Hong Kong's most dangerous time. And it's if they believe that we are silent, again, taking the words from Cardinal Zen's book, if you love the people of Hong Kong, then you will not remain silent. In fact, these are words also spoken by Joshua Wong in the last 24 hours. I've got the article from yesterday's Times newspaper where Joshua said this: "We have no choice. We will continue our international lobbying efforts since truth and justice should not die in silence." It was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who stood against the Nazis, who said not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. And I think we should all take that to heart, that we have the freedom and liberty to speak, and we should not now hold back in raising our voices.
Absolutely. You've largely answered my next question, which was going to be the question of some people say, in a rather defeatist way, you know, what can the West do to confront the Chinese Communist Party? We can't do anything, so we may as well do nothing. You've preempted that question, but is there anything you'd like to add in direct response to that suggestion that actually we can't do anything?
Well, it's like the boy in Robert Louis Stevenson's book who said, "The world is so big and I'm so small, I do not like it at all, at all." You can run away and say, "Oh, there's nothing I can do." Well, of course, nothing happens by itself. Change doesn't come about without effort without people being engaged and working for it. Martin Luther King said that, you know, you've got to have a broken back in carrying the weight of change and the weight of the world on your shoulders. So we need to be much more willing to pay some price in standing with and working for people in Hong Kong, but also read the lessons of history. I come from a mixed background. My mother was an Irish speaker from the west of Ireland. The west of Ireland suffered pretty badly at the hands of the British from time to time, but my father was British and served in the British Army. His brother died in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. They stood against Nazism. And so from both sides of my family, I know that sometimes a price has to be paid, and also to throw off the shackles of tyranny, that you have to be engaged, and it may cost you something. And perhaps for the people of Hong Kong, I would hold up perhaps the example of Gandhi. Gandhi had to take on the very powerful forces. He never resorted to violence. He knew that peaceful protest was the way, and that eventually the edifice would crumble. And we've seen that again and again and again, whether it's Martin Luther King, whether it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the horrors of Nazism, or I think of John Paul II and what happened in Poland with Lech Wałęsa and Solidarity, and the lessons of this last 20th century, that the horrors were also met by extraordinary, courageous people, intrepid people with great integrity, and they saw change in their lifetimes, sometimes because of the giving of their life, and we must be willing to do the same.
Well, my final question, this is obviously the most critical time for Hong Kong in the past 23 years since the handover. It's a pretty dark time for Hong Kong. And in a way, there are perhaps two dangers for people in Hong Kong. One is that they despair, that they feel frustrated, that they give up. The other danger, of course, is that they feel so angry that they resort to more extreme radical action. What would be your message to the people of Hong Kong at this critical time?
Never imitate your opponents. If they use brutality and violence, then you have to use peaceful methods. Always show that you are made of much better stuff. The Chinese Communist Party and their agents constantly try to goad their opponents. They use agent provocateur. It's obvious as well that when people like Darren Mann come and give evidence at Westminster, as he has done, a acclaimed doctor in Hong Kong, willing to come and talk about how medical workers were brutalized, were harassed, arrested, while looking after not just protesters, but also people from the security forces. When that happens, you can see the nature of your opponents. You will not win by being like your opponents. And so be wary also of those who infiltrate, who come in and try and manipulate your movement in order to discredit you. This is the nature of communism and fascism. We've seen it again and again down the ages. We have to be patient, we have to persevere and retain dignity and a belief in the rule of law. And the rest of the world must get in and stand alongside Hong Kong. We must stand with Hong Kong.
Well, Lord Alton, thank you so much for making time to talk today. There's so many more things that we could talk about, but I think we'll conclude there with the powerful words that you've just given. And thank you very much for taking part in this.
A pleasure, Ben.